Welcome everybody back into Nerd Sesh. As always, I'm Carson Breber and alongside me is Logan Camden. And today is the culmination of our top 25 NBA players ever ranking that we have been doing throughout this week. We are into the top 5. If you missed the previous 4 parts, then I recommend you go and check them out. But Logan, very quickly, why don't you just catch us up on the criteria that you are using to make this list?
Okay, over everything, I value team success. Did your team win? Did your skill set lead your team to win when you were on the floor? The next thing I really value, were you the best player on a championship team or a team that got to the NBA Finals? Next, I really heavily value two-way impact. I want guys who are dominant on both ends of the floor. It's really hard for me to rank guys highly who aren't great on both sides of the ball. Next, I really value peak. I value peak over longevity. Were you better than this player at your apex? But as you'll notice in this episode, I think more than any of the other ones, longevity can really come into play here because there are guys who have been remarkably good for 15 to 20 seasons, and that can outweigh a briefer peak than somebody else. So I traditionally will go peak over longevity, but like I said, in some cases it can outweigh the other.
So I believe that impact on winning is everything here. How much are you driving me towards the ultimate goal of winning championships? That being said, we are not just counting rings here. The context, the role that you played, the level that you reached in championship seasons and otherwise is hugely important. I also value peak over longevity. I think maybe a bit more so than you, just based on what we've seen of these lists so far. And I know the 5 guys who are left for you and the 5 guys who are left for me. The highest heights in NBA history are the most important thing to me. But yes, longevity can outweigh that in certain circumstances where the peaks are very comparable and somebody has a glaring advantage. But if you've accomplished more of true historical significance, if you have reached higher heights, if I believe you have given me the greatest chance to reach that championship ceiling, I am probably going to lean towards that person. And then, as we touched on last episode, we're judging you within the context of your era. This is not a question of what would happen if we dropped Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bill Russell into the NBA in 2023. It just doesn't work that way. Every sport is going to evolve. Strategy, technology will get better. Skill will improve. Rules change. There's just way too many factors at play to view it outside of the lens of how did you perform versus your peers in your era. How valuable and dominant were you then? That is how we are judging these players. So, for the last time, Logan, why don't you catch us up on your list so far? 25 through 6, rapid fire. Who have you had?
Yes, sir. 25, John Havlicek. 24, Jason Kidd. 23, Giannis Antetokounmpo. 22, Kawhi Leonard. 21, Moses Malone. 20, Nikola Jokic. 19, Elgin Baylor. 18, Oscar Robertson. 17, Dirk Nowitzki. 16, Julius Erving. 15, Kevin Garnett. 14, Kevin Durant. 13, Steph Curry. 12, Kobe Bryant. 11, Jerry West. 10, Bill Russell. 9, Hakeem Olajuwon. 8, Wilt Chamberlain. 7, Larry Bird. And 6, Magic Johnson.
All right. I had D. Wade at 25, Karl Malone at 23, Charles Barkley at 23, Karl Malone at 24, Chris Paul at 22. I had Moses at 21, Giannis at 20, Dirk Nowitzki at 19, Dr. J at 18, the Big O at 17, Nikola Jokic at 16. I had KG at 15, Jerry West at 14, Kevin Durant at 13, Kobe at 12, Akeem at 11, Steph at 10, Wilt at 9, Shaq at 8, Duncan at 7, and then I had Larry Bird at 6. So without further ado, Logan, who is your number 5 player in NBA history?
At number 5, I have Shaquille O'Neal, and I think Shaq, at his apex, is the most dominant force ever. We truly have never seen somebody use their physical attributes to dominate the way that Shaq did. I mean, he is one of the strongest players ever, and just, one of the most physically imposing players of all time. 7 foot, 325 pounds, and it's comical to me, Carson, when you go back and you look at clips of this era. This is stating the obvious. Shaq is thick, man. Like, put a little pause on that.
Oh, yeah.
Shaq is a thick dude, bro. Like, even like against other bigs, like he makes Marcus Camby, man, look like just skinny. Like he makes Marcus Camby look tiny. He makes other guys of this era look small. It's like a kid playing on a mini hoop, man, on a Nerf hoop. He just dwarfs other bigs of this era. And I think what a lot of people get wrong, right, when we think of Shaq of this era, Carson, it's mostly, oh, it's just dominating posters. It's Shaq taking guys to the rack. It's him dunking everything. And that is a part of it, right? Shaq was able to physically dominate because of his size and because of his strength, but he also had really good footwork, and Shaq would weaponize this strength with great touch as well. Like, he's taking little touch shots, little baby hooks too, and it just was unstoppable. He's also an elite lob threat too. I think we forget how athletic Shaq was at that size. We've never seen somebody that athletic at that freakish kind of size. At his peak, from 1994 to 2003, 10 really great seasons. I think Shaq was almost, out of his prime towards 04-05, and when he gets into Miami. He's 28, 12, and 3 on nearly 58% from the field with 2.5 blocks a night. He's a 6-time league leader in field goal percentage in that span. He is the most efficient and one of the best scorers in basketball. He also led in field goal percentage another 4 times in his career. Shaq was just remarkably efficient because of the shot quality that he was able to generate. He leads a number 1 offense. He leads 4 more number 2 offenses. 9 of them overall were top 5, and he led 1 more offense that was top 10. But it's just how nobody had an answer for him, Carson, at his peak. Shaq was unstoppable. He averaged 35 points per game in the NBA Finals twice, something MJ only also did. In the 2000 Finals, he's 38, 17, and 2. 2001 Finals, he's 33, 16, and 5. And in 2002, he's 36, 12, and 4. We've just never seen somebody dominate on the biggest stage of basketball quite like Shaq did. Like, I think when you were looking at a 3-season peak, there's a real argument that Shaq is the most dominant and greatest player ever. That's what a lot of people thought back in the early 2000s. This is in a stacked era of centers, too. Shaq has really good competition in this era. I did this thought exercise with Bill Russell when I went over great centers of his era, but take any of these great defensive bigs of this era, Shaq is dominating. In career matchups versus Dikembe, he's 22-12 on 52% from the field. He's 21-8 against Dikembe. Against Alonzo Mourning, he's 30-12, while holding Alonzo to 44% from the field. Versus David Robinson. Now, granted, some of these numbers are a little bit skewed because David Robinson played into his older years against Shaq. Shaq's 26-12 against David Robinson, one of the greatest defensive players ever. Against Patrick Ewing, he's 29-12. He's holding Patrick Ewing to 44% from the field. Versus Ben Wallace, one of the best defensive centers of his era, 25-10 on 59% from the field. Shaq was just dominant. It didn't matter who you threw at him. I think this is the toughest era of centers to play basketball in, and Shaq is head and shoulders against all of these guys. Now, I also think that we tend to forget how dominant Shaq was on the interior. Now, he's not switchable. He's not extremely versatile, right? He's not a guy who's going to switch out to the perimeter. I don't mean it in that way.
I thought you meant offensively, and I was like, oh, we forgot about how dominant Shaq is on the interior? Interesting. I didn't get that memo.
Hey, Shaq, switch out to the perimeter real quick. I want you to step up on this 3-ball. No, Shaq's not doing any of that, but he is one of the best deterrents at his peak on the interior. Again, 2.5 blocks per game for 10 seasons, and he's stifling some of the best other centers of this era. So, insane two-way value, the most dominant offensive force, I think, ever at his apex. But I think everybody above him, Carson, is where longevity comes into play. Shaq is dominant. The best player in basketball, arguably, for 12 seasons, but everybody above him.
Wait, no. He's not arguably the best player in basketball for 12 seasons. Where'd you get that?
Well, he's top 5. Sorry, I forgot Michael Jordan existed, but he's top 5.
There's a big difference.
He's the best player in basketball, I think, for a solid 4 to 5 season stretch there towards the early part of the 2000s.
I think that's a bit generous, but much closer.
I would say everybody above him has better longevity or did end up reaching a higher apex. But that 3-season stretch is one of the greatest in basketball history, and nobody had an answer for Shaq. So I think because of his offensive dominance, that is ultimately what puts him in the top 5 for me.
So I had Shaq at number 8, and I think that he is one of the great offensive engines that we have ever seen because he is the greatest paint scoring force that we have ever seen in terms of that sheer unstoppability, which is what we all think of when we use the word dominance. I do, however, have a general preference for a different level of versatility. And Shaq is uniquely limited in terms of his versatility, right? He was a great post scorer. He did have the very high level hook. He could go to the turnaround a bit. It wasn't a great shot, but it was in his bag. But obviously, right, he is not a overly capable jump shooter. And although he is a very solid playmaking big, he is not in the upper echelons of playmaking when we're talking about great players. And I just really value that hybrid of scoring and playmaking that we see from the Larry Birds and the Magic Johnsons and the Michael Jordans and the LeBron James, of course, and the overall offensive versatility that those guys have. And I also think it is worth noting that Shaq's value offensively is undeniable. The constant attention that he demanded and the gravity of that and the opportunities that would open up for his teammates, that is going to elevate team offenses a ton. But I do think that he was more reliant on a great perimeter player because of some of his offensive limitations than the other incredibly complete all-time great offensive players who we see up here. And then I would say the other reason that he's probably not in my top 5 is that I don't think he compares to the true great defensive bigs. Like, I understand that the shot blocking numbers are high at his peak, but for a lot of his career, his engagement was very meh, highly inconsistent. His foot speed after the Orlando years was not very good. The sharpness of his rotations and help, it was just much closer to average than it was to great. So I do view Shaq as an above average big, a good defensive big, but there's a reason that there's a lot of years in his prime where his team defenses are mediocre to bad. You don't see that with the truly great defensive bigs because singularly they are so dominant in protecting the rim, or maybe they have a different level of versatility than a guy like Shaq. So his sheer dominance in the paint absolutely puts him into my top 10. The peak that we did see in that 3-year stretch when I do believe he was the best player in the world, 2000, 2002, and what he did in the playoffs and the finals is remarkable. But some of those limitations to me do make him a step below some of the more complete all-time greats who I have in my top 5. Maybe one exception in terms of completeness, but it's because of an overwhelming value on one side of the ball that we talked about last episode, and I will talk about some more in this one.
Yeah, I understand that versatility, and I want to ask you something about his peak, too. I think it's as high as a center has ever reached, but season for season, would you take 1967 Wilt over any of these three seasons of Shaq?
I think I would. I mean, it's very close, but the playmaking value that you had from Wilt then combined with that scoring efficiency, combined with defense that I would view in another tier, like Wilt was a dominant defense, propelling the number 1 defense in the league. Shaq was so much more inconsistent with his effort there. It's close, though, because, I mean, Shaq is a more dominant scoring force. But I think that if you're looking at, like, 1972 Kareem in that range, I would prefer Kareem because of the edge in two-way value. Both are incredibly dominant, absurdly efficient scoring forces. Both are good playmaking bigs, but I do think that Shaq is a step behind a lot of the other greats on that defensive end of the floor.
I think Kareem weaponized his playmaking a lot better, too. It was just always more of a constant threat. And I think Kareem, I don't know, we can forget because he's not as prevalent in our minds because of how long ago he played. Was drawing constant attention there on the low block, too, because of how dominant he was, too. So I think it's marginal. I think I would take Shaq at his apex above those two guys just because of the gravity. I get the versatility aspect of both of those guys, but I think for peak, I would take Shaq number 1, but it is close between those two guys. So who do you actually have in at your number 5 spot?
So the one other thing that I want to say on Shaq versus Wilt, why I have Shaq higher, it's not about absolute apex. It's about the consistency of reaching something close to their apex, which, as we talked about last episode, plenty with Wilt. I just think Shaq did more regularly over a 12-plus year stretch than Wilt did throughout his career. My number 5 is one of the great offensive engines we have ever seen, and that is Magic Johnson. And I want to start talking about Magic, not with the fact that he's obviously the greatest passer and playmaker ever, but with his phenomenal scoring versatility and efficiency and the pressure that applied to defenses. Because I think when we look at raw assist numbers, they can be very misleading. To me, there's two kinds of high volume assist playmakers. You have the generally, it's going to be a point guard, primary ball handler, who is a great technical passer, right? Who can place the ball well, who can control the tempo of the game pretty well, who will see your typical openings that arise, and who's very unselfish setting up their teammates, like a Rajon Rondo, like a Mark Jackson, like an older John Stockton when he had lost some of his quickness that would put more pressure on the defense, but he still had that IQ in passing. And then you have the guys who are actively creating advantages, who are reshaping the defense and pressuring it with the threat of their scoring. And then out of that, they can create more high value opportunities, right? Versus a really well-placed entry pass, it is a lob that is created by the fact that you have two defenders collapsing on a drive, or it's a high value kick out to a wide open shooter, right? That's more valuable. That's going to create more valuable assists and a better team offense. Magic is the epitome of the latter because in large part of his scoring. Out of the post, he had a pretty much unaffectable hook shot at 6'9", very high release point, and a beautiful runner, variety of runners that he could get to routinely. So the touch scoring in the paint is phenomenal. Out of the pick and roll, he was a strong mid-range shooter, and he paired that with some elite finishing in the lane, the runners like we've talked about, and also around the rim. He was super adaptable, incredibly agile as an athlete at 6'9", great at finding finishing angles in traffic. And then his overall combination of downhill speed, body control, and ball handling at 6'9" was totally unique for that time. And we are so privileged by the great big ball handlers in today's NBA. Tons of dudes 6'5 plus who move with the fluidity of point guards. But at Magic's time, I mean, completely unprecedented and unrivaled in the league. And of course, that made him a problem in the paint, his ability to finish and just get in there regularly, and combined with his rebounding value, made him probably the greatest and most prolific transition player ever, because although he didn't have a lightning quick first step, that sort of full court speed, especially for a 6'9 dude, was pretty damn good. So overall, his scoring resume throughout his career, 19.5 points per game on plus 7.3% true shooting versus league average. That puts him in the absolute top tier of scoring efficiency on this list. It's with Kareem, it's with Steph Curry, it's with Charles Barkley. It's a phenomenal number. But then he is the greatest passer ever. And I think when we're talking about creating advantages, he is the most audacious, brilliant playmaker we have ever seen. Nobody has ever needed a slimmer window to say, yeah, I'll go ahead and try that pass and I'll do it perfectly. I'll create a great look for a teammate that just wouldn't be there for any other player in the NBA. Perfect lob passes in traffic, incredibly timed and paced kickouts and bounce passes out of doubles, which he would draw out of the post. These incredible one-handed hook passes in traffic. And that's the important thing to consider, right? He could dominate out of the post, drawing a double. He could dominate coming downhill out of pick and roll, drawing extra attention and help there. That variety as a scorer fed his variety as a playmaker. But at his height, he just had every angle available to him. His vision, to me, is the best that we've ever seen. And the placement, the timing, the velocity, the touch, it was so consistently brilliant. And he's the most deceptive and creative passer that we've ever seen, which just added another layer to that creation. And especially in transition, right? You have Magic coming downhill on you. That's terrifying, but he is able to make that no-look pass last second as effectively as anybody else, draw the defense in, create a wide open look for another teammate. So the totality of his playmaking impact, to me, is unrivaled. 11.2 assists per game in his career is untouchable, and they are those extremely high-value assists that we've been talking about. So that all-around offensive brilliance is why he is one of the greatest offensive engines and all-around just elevators of team success that we've ever seen. And I think it's worth noting, of course, he had the privilege of playing with some really good talent throughout his career, most notably Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But the Lakers' offenses reached their apex long after Kareem's peak. It's about Magic's peak. 85-90, they have 6 straight top 2 offenses. 5 of them are number 1 offenses. And Kareem in that stretch 87, 88, he's scoring 17 and then 14 points per game. 89, he is old man Kareem. He's scoring 10 a game. 90, he's retired. The offense, which was already the best in the league in 89, gets even better. That's the value that Magic had as this scoring, playmaking hybrid. And we do see him up his scoring volume in that stretch as he needed to more. The 1987 season in particular is one of the greatest ever to me. Leads the number one offense ever at that time. Goes 24-12 on 6.5% true shooting, better than league average. And the overall result of this is that the Lakers won 74% of their games in his career. That is a 61 win pace sustained over a 12-year career. And again, it was about Magic in large part. Without Kareem over those years, he went 23-8. That's a 74% win rate. And then in the 2 years after Kareem retired, when that supporting cast is not as strong, of course, he has Worthy and Byron Scott, but like you can't view that as outlier talent. The Lakers still go 119-39. They win 75% of their games. They make the finals in 89 when Kareem is, again, a total shell of himself, and they make the finals in 91. They make the finals in 87 and 88 when Kareem is no longer a superstar kind of player. By 88, he's not even a star. So there's no denying that Magic is one of the 5 greatest offensive engines that we've ever seen, in my opinion. And the consistency with which he propelled the best offense in the league is unrivaled. Well, Steve Nash, actually, in terms of number one offenses, but I would say like Magic being clearly the best guy has the advantage there versus Nash in those Mav years playing with Dirk. The weakness for Magic is that he's a super meh defender, and we talked about this last episode. You said you viewed him as a good defender. I wouldn't even agree with that. I would say he's pretty much dead on average. He was prolific in terms of generating steals. A lot of that is a product of gambling. He was a really good defensive rebounder at his size. He could defend the post at his size, and he was a good positional defender, but didn't have versatility there, despite obviously being a point guard offensively. He didn't have the lateral quickness, especially as he got older, to guard on the perimeter. His effort, I would say, was not so great consistently. Despite his size, he wasn't a good help side rim protector, just wasn't that sort of vertical athlete, didn't have that sort of sharpness in terms of rotation and awareness for help defense. So overall, I just think he's meh. He's in the bottom tier of defenders in the top 25, honestly. But I value so much when you can like singularly propel me to be so historically great on one side of the ball, and that is what Magic did. And so when we're talking about him versus Larry, it's super close. Larry has a two-way edge. I don't think that outweighs that I prefer Magic as this offensive machine to Larry. Even there is a conversation to be had because Larry has the off-ball edge. He has the versatility edge in that Magic was going to dictate every possession, and I do like guys who can pressure the defense in multiple ways constantly without the ball in their hands and allow some of the other stars they may be playing with to thrive as on-ball talents. But I think Magic's monumental efficiency, like tier 1 all-time, and the fact that he is the greatest playmaker ever and how much that enhanced all of his teammates so consistently, and the result that is leading to like the greatest stretch of team offense ever, that gives him the edge to me. And again, as I talked about last episode, he sustained it a little longer. Larry, those 1990 to 92 seasons is just not the same. Magic has 12 years where he is a top 5 player, has 9 straight years where he's top 3 in MVP voting, and he won even more than Larry with the 5 rings, the 9 finals appearances, although I do think it's worth noting how much weaker the West was than the East when we're looking at just raw finals trips. But that offensive value to me is enough to put Magic in my top 5. How consistently it propelled the greatest teams, some of them that we've ever seen.
Yeah, I considered Magic up to my number 4 spot too. Ultimately, two-way value, I think, is what holds him back from being higher. But the offensive brilliance is insane. I mean, Carson, he's still, to this day, I think the stat that I looked up was minimum 500 games played. I don't know what the exact minimum is. He has the highest winning percentage in NBA history. You know what I mean? When you were looking at value in terms of turning your skill set, which in this case was making offenses great, there's arguably nobody better in terms of transferring it to team success. all of the number one offenses, all of the top, two offenses that he let out. Granted, yes, he does play with some great players. All of these guys play with great players. Nobody has made their teams better. 74% is the highest. I think Bird is second, and there's some other legends up there, but it's like 3% too. It is a major difference. Magic still does have the highest win percentage in NBA history, so Magic has a really good case. And I did consider him even higher, dude. Do you think he's the greatest offensive engine of all time, considering that, or would you still have other guys higher?
I don't think he's number one. I think he's top 5. I think that there are a couple
Wow.
guys who have the advantage in terms of stylistic versatility, in terms of on-ball and off-ball value, and also in terms of pure scoring and position. I think Magic is a great, highly underrated scorer, but I think that there are a couple dudes who could reach that best scorer and best playmaker on the planet level, or dudes who could have a sort of constant off-ball value like we might see with a Steph Curry, where some of those things can outweigh Magic's pure on-ball playmaking brilliance. But he's in my top 5, and he's in my tier 1. And by the way, all those dudes are so close that I think I have said in passing, like, well, Steph is arguably the greatest offensive engine ever. LeBron is arguably the greatest offensive engine. Magic, Jokic, MJ, like, I'll sort of throw it out there for all those guys at times because I think that there is an argument for all of them. It depends on what you value. But yeah, and it does matter to me, right? Like the 75% win rate without Kareem. Magic was an exceptional offensive force on his own, and that team success is really remarkable for that long. So, who do you have at number 4, Logan?
Another one of the guys whose skill set directly drove and impacted winning. At number 4, I have Tim Duncan, and we talked a lot about him in depth last season. And Carson, you threw out a lot of good numbers that I also had. He is one of the greatest defenders of all time. You threw out some of these. He's 5 number 1 defenses, 14 of them top 3. 17 times he led a top 10 defense. He's a 15-time all-defense selection, a 15-time all-NBA selection. 10 of those all-NBA first team. And he won 50 or more games every season of his career. Tim Duncan was a winner, flat out, point blank, period. I talk about him driving winning. He is the 8th highest winning percentage ever. He won 72% of his games. And when you're talking about genuine legends, no disrespect to like Casey Jones or Sam Jones, you have some 60 Celtics on that list that are skewed. In terms of legends, he's trailing only Magic, Larry, and Kawhi. And I think it's important to note, he's got over 400 more career games played than any of those guys. Like, that is with a much larger sample size where Duncan is still dominating and winning. He has consistent success regardless of his surrounding talent. Yes, at his apex, and I want to point this out too, he does play with great players. Tony Parker is, I think, really underrated in terms of he's a great rim pressure, great at finishing around the rack. Manu Ginobili is one of the craftiest, one of the most fun guys to ever watch play, was a great six-man. He plays with Bruce Bowen, a great perimeter defender. He plays with David Robinson, one of the greatest defensive players ever. Granted, some of that is where David Robinson is older. So he plays with Kawhi Leonard towards the end of his career, where Kawhi isn't at his apex, but he's still one of the best defenders on the planet and a pretty well-rounded player. So Tim plays with a lot of talent throughout his career, but he is the driving force. He is that guy. And I think we forget a lot too, Carson, that Tim at his apex, dude, was an insane athlete and really fluid and a great mover. That's what really surprised me when going back and watching Tim from his prime in the early 2000s is we tend to look at Tim as, pretty slow. He sticks around the mid-range, hits an elbow jumper, goes in the low block, gets up and down the court pretty slow because that's how Tim was at the end of his career, and he was still very effective. But in his prime, was an insane athlete, was a great vertical athlete, was really fluid, and got up and down the floor with ease. Is one of the best help side rim protectors of all time when he was with David Robinson. Became one of the best rim protectors of all time, period, when he actually slid over to the 5. And I prefer Duncan to Shaq because of his unparalleled longevity and effectiveness. To me, being that dominant and that effective in driving winning for nearly 20 seasons and being one of the best defenders on the planet for that long is just more important because he did it for so long. And I think in comparison to Kareem, because I think Tim and Kareem mirror each other in different ways. Tim defensively with his longevity, Kareem offensively with his longevity. And I think that Duncan contributes more to his last two championships than Kareem does to those last two championships because of how effective he was at that old age defensively. And his peak is something special too. Offensively, you could just dump it to him on the low block, and he's got jab steps. He's hitting little tiny baby step backs to get that mid-range shot off and to create separation. The 03 finals, we talked about that, one of our greatest peaks and greatest runs ever. 24, 15, and 5, 4 blocks a night. It's one of the greatest ever. Now, I do slightly value offense more. That's why Kareem outweighs Tim Duncan. I think that's why I have him higher. And the longevity is pretty similar. But Tim's one of the greatest defensive players of all time. He is one of the great deterrents of all time. And he did it for so long. I just think we kind of take for granted how long Tim did it for. He made it seem routine. But I don't think his offensive apex quite reaches any of my top 3 guys, and I'm going to slightly value that a little more. But I think Tim has a legit top 5 case. I think many people have him number 8, number 9. I think that's much too low for a guy that did it that long, that directly drove winning, that at his apex was a great offensive force, was consistently one of the best defensive players in basketball. I got Tim at number 4, and I think more people should wake up to it, man. I think he's definitively top 5.
Definitively top 5. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think where I would have to disagree with you there is that it's really dependent on what you value. For example, if you are a pure peak over longevity person, well, then I don't think he has a particularly strong case for top 5. He has a great peak, an underrated peak. What he's doing from 2001 to 03, right? Carrying those teams with subpar supporting cast to 60 wins and a title in 2003, one of the great playoff runs that we've ever seen. All of that is remarkable. However, I still think that the overall offensive brilliance that you get from the LeBrons, the Michael Jordans, the Larry Birds, the Magic Johnsons propelling team success at the highest level, I mean, I still think absolute peak to peak, the multiple years that we see from Shaq at his just straight up best is probably a bit better, a bit more valuable than Duncan. But Duncan's advantage is how long he sustains it, right? I think the thing for me is just Duncan was going to drive you to be a really good team defense throughout his prime. And he, to me, is a top 3 defender ever, right? I mean, 11 straight top 3 defenses to start his career. But the amount of time at which he was a legitimately really good offensive number 1 is kind of only a handful of years. I think once you're getting into the mid-2000s, he is no longer quite at that level. I think if you do look at the 2005, 2007 runs, he is definitely more reliant on Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili for that sort of offensive creation, and he is not the most overwhelming defensive force we've ever seen, like a Bill Russell, where that is like so far and away what's driving them to be the best team in the league. So I don't like necessarily have a problem with Duncan top 5. I just think peak to peak, it comes down to what we're talking about, where I value those great scoring, playmaking hybrids who drove the historically great offenses for the most part. And Timmy was a good offensive hub, not in the all-time tiers there. So it's like the same reason that I wouldn't have Akeem in my top 5, right? I mean, Akeem was a monumentally great defensive player. He was a good offensive number 1, but not of the same caliber as the all-time greats there.
I still think that defense is what drove those teams to win, even up to like 2007. I mean, I think that was still the foundation of all those Spurs teams. And I think the fact that Tim was able to, I do want to emphasize that even more, is that the longevity is such a key component of this, because Tim was never like a negative on the court. He was still effective. You can't say that about a lot of guys on this list. You know, they age, they either become less efficient, they lose some athleticism that really affects them. Like, Tim was still an effective player into that last title run. Obviously, he's not the guy. He's not what he was once offensively, but he's still a very important cog in that defensive machine and a big part of the reason that they won that title. He's not the reason, but it is a big component. And those defenses were great year in, year out. So I understand. I know you value the higher quality offensive engines there. I just think his how great he was for how long he was great,
Mm-hmm.
and how great he was defensively for the entirety of his career is what does it for me. But I get it.
Yeah, no, the totality of his career is just like remarkably impressive. My number five, or excuse me, my number four is Bill Russell, which I think is an interesting contrast to what I was just talking about in preferring, in the scope of modern NBA history, the dudes who can propel those historically great offenses. I talked about this last episode. Russell is a one of one exception in the fact that he is by so far the greatest defensive player ever, by so far the most impactful defensive player ever, given the era that he played in and how crucial taking the rim away was, how much he excelled there, and how much he was therefore able to elevate his teams defensively to far surpass everybody else in the league, far surpass everybody else in NBA history, and that being far and away the driving force in 11 titles in 13 years. So, first of all, I just want to talk about his defensive skill set. An absolutely sensational rim protector, right? Perfect timing, agility, quickness, and absurd leaping ability made him a massive shot blocker. People estimate 8 to 10 a game, although the numbers weren't official at that time. But even more importantly, he was so cerebral as a helper and was a constant intimidator and deterrent. Nobody has made opposing offensive players question taking that shot around the rim more. And the value to that alone for an offense is monumental. But then versus a Wilt Chamberlain of that era, for example, he had such an advantage in terms of his ability to defend out on the perimeter more with his agility out there and to affect jump shooters. He had great hands generating steals out of the post and could make people uncomfortable there, and really is an elite post defender. And Logan, I was thinking, you talked about how Wilt, quote unquote, got his against Bill Russell in a lot of their head-to-head matchups, but Wilt's true shooting percentage playing against Bill Russell took a 4-point hit. So if you think about that, he's turning peak scoring Wilt, who is already a historically bad playmaker when you're looking at the Warriors years, which is when Wilt's putting up the monster scoring numbers, into all of a sudden a guy who's like basically a league average efficiency scorer and a bad playmaker. Raw numbers don't matter at that point. That's not good offense. So that's what Bill was able to do to the premier scoring sensation of that generation. And just insanely disciplined as well, Russell. In terms of the defensive role that he had, his activity there, very good at limiting his mistakes. And this is why I say that no modern standard can apply to Bill Russell, and why the prototypical thought of, okay, well, I want to have a guy who can be a number one on both ends of the floor, certainly a number one offensively, is different. I read some of these numbers last episode, but you'll have to bear with me again. He came in as a rookie, improved the Celtics defensive rating by 8 points. They go from 6th of 8 teams to comfortably number one. When he left, that defense fell off by 10 points. They go from comfortably number one to 8 of 14 teams. And keep in mind, that is Bill at his respective low points, right? That's youngest Bill before he reaches his apex, and then that's oldest Bill after he has reached his apex. The Celtics were the number one defense 12 of his 13 years by an average of over 4 points per 100 possessions. That is a much larger gap on average for more than a decade than we have seen between the number one and number two defense in the last 25 plus years. And that's just what I looked at. I'm not sure that we've ever seen it in a single season from anybody other than the Russell Celtics, who did it routinely. He also led 10 straight number one playoff defenses to start his career by an average, in terms of its edge over second place, of 4.2 points per 100 possessions. The Celtics were 3 times last in offensive rating with Bill Russell. Every one of those years, they were first in net rating, meaning they have the highest point differential in the league because they are that much better defensively, and they won the title. So he is just by so far the greatest single force that we have ever seen on one side of the ball. And the Celtics didn't have to have good team offenses to ultimately win these titles, right? They were able to do it with flat out bad offensive production. And of course, we look at the volume from some of his teammates and we say, okay, that plus all the championships, how great those guys were. But we know John Havlicek was an average efficiency scorer who didn't propel very good team offenses. Bob Cousy, right, was a historically inefficient scorer, although he was a very good playmaker. But in the years that he was playing with Russell wasn't just the kind of guy who would singularly elevate a team offense. Sam Jones is the offensive number one scorer on a couple of those title teams, right? He's not some sort of historical outlier in terms of talent. And that's just my point, is that it's all about Russell's impact. That's where all the winning comes from. People will bring up the supporting cast. They won 72% of their games with Bill Russell. They won 50% without him. So he's turning them from an average team into by far the best team in the league, the most dominant dynasty that we have ever seen. I also do think he is generally underrated offensively. I think people look at the shooting efficiency, first of all, and think it's a bit uglier than it is, just given the context of playing in the 60s. He scored at league average efficiency. I'm not going to come out here and say he was a super highly skilled, productive scorer. He wasn't a dominant rim finisher. He had a bit of a post game with a short range jumper and a hook, but he wasn't great in those respects. But some of the other things that he did offensively were really valuable. He's one of the best passing bigs that we've seen out of the high post, spotting cutters, running handoffs, and he was a great transition player with his incredible ability to run the floor, his playmaking that he possessed there, uniquely good ball handling for a center in the 1960s, that elite athleticism, and being a top 2 rebounder that we've ever seen. I also think that rebounding gives him some more value offensively than he gets credit for, because they didn't make the distinction between offensive and defensive rebounds, but securing extra possessions as well. So I just think you look at the 1960 Celtics. Why did they win? Because they were by far the greatest defense ever. Why were they by far the greatest defense ever? Because of Bill Russell. Before him, they were bad defensively. After him, they were bad defensively. They were great after Cousy and Heinsohn. They were great before Hondo. There's one constant who in that era, even with a limitation that if we were applying to today's standards, like, I don't think you could singularly dominate the game defensively in any era after that, like Bill Russell did. But that's the era he played in. That's how he and his value should be judged. And that was the most valuable thing that anybody in that era did. More valuable than Wilt's high volume scoring, more valuable even than Oscar Robertson generating these great team offenses. Being that far leaps and bounds above every other team on one side of the ball, we've never seen anything like it. And that was an era in which that was possible with the greatest defensive player ever, and it could drive the greatest dynasty ever, and that's what it did. So I do believe that he belongs at my number 4 spot.
Yeah, we went into this a little bit last episode too, and I do agree with you that Bill is an underrated offensive player, great passer. The Celtics are so unselfish. The ball movement is so much fun to watch. That's what makes any sport great, is the ball movement, is the playmaking. That creates easy shots. And the Celtics of this era move the ball impeccably well, and Bill was an important cog in that too. The reason that Bill wasn't higher for me was that two-way value. And maybe I'm looking at it through the wrong lens, because I'm not looking at it just in this era. I'm looking at it more of in a vacuum, right? When I look at pure two-way value, Bill just couldn't score the ball the way other greats could, and that's ultimately why I went with him over Wilt. I do think Bill is the greatest defensive player. How he was able to directly affect winning as a defensive playmaker of this era and just defensive player overall hasn't been matched by any defensive player in the history of basketball. I think, again, uniquely because of the era he played in. I did look at this. Two-way value is super important to me, and because Bill wasn't an all-time great scorer, that's ultimately why I kept him down at number 10 on my list. But, I mean, Carson, you make an impeccable case for Bill, and he's the greatest winner in the history of the sport, too, and that really does matter. But I am going to hold it against him that he wasn't a great scorer.
Well, I think what's interesting is that we can look at some of the players on this list, and they have certain limitations, right? Like Magic defensively. But you can be so overwhelmingly great on the other side of the ball that it outweighs that. And that just hasn't been possible defensively for the last 50 years. Russell is, I think, the only guy ever who meets that criteria. But just like you would have supporting pieces defensively that are making the Lakers a top 10 defense, right? If it's Michael Cooper, if it's younger Kareem when he was a superior rim protector, Bill Russell could have guys who, I mean, weren't even going to do it efficiently, weren't going to drive good team offenses, but could literally put the ball in the basket enough to where they were so overwhelmingly dominant defensively that they would win games. So I just think modern standards don't really apply to him. The game was so different, and as we went in depth on last episode, I understand your thinking because this is something that I've flipped on compared to when I did a top 10 a year ago. But I just think it shouldn't be viewed in terms of, okay, well, how would this translate to this era and all that? It should be about, okay, how much did it drive winning in your era? And that's what Russell did pretty much as well as anybody that we've ever seen. So with that, we are into the top 3, Logan. Who's in your 3 spot?
At number 3, I have one of the most accomplished NBA players of all time, and that is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I alluded to it earlier. He's one of 2 players that I think have better longevity than Tim Duncan. I mean, he plays forever, and he was dominant offensively. He's more offensively gifted than Tim. The clips are stupid, man. When you go back against Kareem, like, I thought it was a joke, Carson. Growing up, hearing my dad talk about Kareem, hearing any old-timers talk about Kareem, oh, the old skyhook, oh, it was unblockable. Man, dude, he really did turn to it almost every time. It's like, you think about the great players' shots, right? The bread and butter looks. LeBron looking at his hand before he wets a 3. Never missed that. LeBron never missed that shot. Dirk, the one-legged fadeaway, right? The Kobe, the turnaround over his shoulder. A Kevin Durant pull-up, right? You think about the bread and butter looks. There's never been a bread and butter look. Oh, the soundboard shuffle, too. I need to put some respect on Jokic. Sorry, I didn't mean to leave him out either. There's never been a more effective, efficient, easy bread and butter look in the history of basketball than the skyhook. It's crazy, man. Like, you just go back and look. Kareem's doing that every possession. It reminds me of when me and Carson play one-on-one, and then he just big bodies me on the low block and is able to get to it every time. He's just big body. The size advantage is crazy. But instead of doing that to a little old guy like me, Kareem's doing that to big, other, great centers of his era, 6'10", 7-foot guys, and he's making them look like little kids out there. He's sunning them. He's truly one of the most unstoppable post scorers of all time. It's crazy. And the gravity, we talk about a Shaq, and I think that's a lot more intuitive in thinking about how gravity works, right? Oh, Shaq's so big. He's so strong. You have to put 2 bodies on him to stop him. You had to do that to Kareem in this era as well, and I love how Kareem weaponized that and used it to create higher quality shots. If that was faking the ball low or faking it high and faking a pass that's going to open up a shot angle that wasn't there before, or if that angle is there and there's a passing angle available, Kareem would use it. He would weaponize his shot for playmaking as well. So he's an unstoppable post scorer that was able to also, not at the highest level, but weaponize his playmaking to an extent. He's really good on the low block, too, with his counters. He's an ambidextrous finisher that if you gave him the lane, too, could finish with either hand. He's simply one of the greatest offensive players of all time, right? He was the all-time scoring leader until this very last season when LeBron broke it. He's got 17 seasons of over 20 points per game. I do think we can tend to overrate slightly his rings, though, and I think that's important to notice. He is really accomplished. 6-time MVP, I think that's important, too, because, Kareem is unequivocally the best player in basketball for that long. Not many players can say that. I think that peak cements him as a top 3 player, but I think if you're just looking at rings, if you're just looking at hardware, we can tend to overvalue these a little bit. He's got one where he is the unquestioned guy, and that is with Oscar Robertson, too. I don't think that means a lot. Oscar wasn't at his absolute apex either, but he's only got one more where I think you can consider him the number 1. And again, like you mentioned last episode, Carson, Magic Johnson steps in and closes that finals out. He's got 2 more rings where he's the number 2 behind Magic, and then he's got 2 more where he's a solid playoff contributor, right? So it's not like 6 rings where Kareem is the end-all, be-all driving force. Still, though, insane peak, insane longevity, because he didn't get the title more as the guy. I'm not going to hold that against him. They won titles. They won rings. He drove winning. He's on, as the guy, he's got 3 number 1 defenses. He's got, 3 number 1 offenses, 2 number 1 defenses, another number 2 offense, another 2 top 2 defenses. Those are just in Milwaukee. And that's where the longevity, I think, factors in too, man. It's been rare that guys can hold up. He's a 20-point-per-game scorer until he's 38. That's insane. So I just think there are guys with more versatility, more well-rounded value that I prefer, obviously, the 2 greatest players in basketball history that I think have kind of been consensus for the past couple years in LeBron and Michael Jordan. Let me ask you this, Carson. I mean, I'm going to assume you have Kareem at 3. I mean, do you think that there's a legit case for Kareem to be higher than 3 at this point? I know some people, probably old timers, may give an argument for it. Is there a legit argument for him to be top 2?
I don't think there's a strong one. What I will say is I think there's no argument for him to be below 3, really, in my opinion, either. So he's pretty solidly locked into this spot. What I would say, when you're talking about the rings argument, it's like, yeah, his 6 rings are not equal to Michael Jordan's 6 rings because of the role that he played. But, of course, I also don't think that we should look at a guy's ability to drive winning only by rings. Like, before Magic, Kareem was, first of all, clearly the best player in the world for a decade, which we have, I mean, I don't know if we've ever seen it as clearly as it was with Kareem in the 70s. I think LeBron was the best player in the world for over a decade, but I don't think it was as like undeniable even as it was for Kareem, right? You have Dr. J as his best challenger. You have Bill Walton for 77 and most of 78, but neither of those guys really make a super compelling case. And Kareem, over those years, throughout the 1970s, his teams win 66% of his games when he's out there. That's a 54-win pace. He went 29-10 without Oscar Robertson in the years that they played together. That's a 74% win rate. One of the things that people will hold against Kareem or sort of bring up in passing is that he missed the playoffs in back-to-back years. 1975, the Bucks missed the playoffs, but Kareem goes 35-30 when he plays. They go 3-14 without him. He was uniquely dominant in his ability to propel dominant offenses and defenses. I actually believe the greatest big ever in that respect. Like 70s, he drives 4 top 2 offenses for the Bucks and 3 top 5 offenses for the Lakers and leads 4 straight top 2 offenses in Milwaukee, 2 of which were number 1. So all of those things considered, he has to be top 3. Having a decade as the dominant force in the league by far, and then contributing to those Lakers teams as he did is undeniable. But yeah, I mean, there's something about the overall offensive force, scoring and playmaking, while being great two-way players that you have for Michael Jordan and LeBron James, leading to just repeated contention and title runs that is on a different level to me. But Kareem's incredible. It was a blend of size and scoring skill and efficiency that we had never seen before, right? I mean, massive dude, 7'2", so graceful, body control, so good. You mentioned how elegant and easy the sky hook was, but he was also very good in terms of the deceptiveness of his movements, his ability to weaponize fake passes and whatnot, or to play off of the hook and then spin the other way. And he was a really good playmaking big, 4.5 assists per game over his first 10 seasons. His career, 24.6 points per game on plus 7.3% true shooting versus league average. Another guy in the top tier of efficiency. And then you have the historic longevity, where even if Magic is the best guy on that team, in my opinion, for 82 and on, 85, Kareem is the finals MVP at 38 years old, puts up 26, 9, and 5. 86 in the playoffs, he still puts up 26 a game in that run at 39. So although his rebounding and his defensive value waned, he was still bigger and more skilled than all the other bigs out there, and he was able to get to the bread and butter stuff efficiently and at good volume until he was almost 40. So I just don't think there's any argument for him lower than this, but I also think the all-around greatness, the ability to drive winning at the highest levels of the 2 guys above him, I think that they have created a gap. I think that they've separated themselves. And between the 2 of them, I honestly don't think there's a wrong answer at this point. I think there's a lot of bad arguments, a whole bunch of them, frankly, more bad arguments than there are good arguments. But I think there are good reasons to decide on either one of them as your GOAT. But with that said, Logan, who do you have in the 2 spot?
It is the time-tested debate, man. It's as old as it's as old as anything else, man. LeBron James versus Michael Jordan, and I have always been a Michael Jordan guy. I am still a Michael Jordan guy. At number 2, I have LeBron James. I do want to say this, and I've not held this opinion for very long. I understand if you put LeBron ahead of Michael Jordan because of longevity, because of peak, whatever, like you said, because of whatever justification. Well, I won't say that. There are some bad arguments. So maybe not whatever justification, but I understand if you put LeBron ahead of MJ. A lot of people like to boil it down to just Michael went 6-0 in the finals, never played in a game 7. LeBron has lost so many times. It's like context matters in so many of that. Like, LeBron's not winning some of those finals against the Warriors. He's just not. He's just outmatched. LeBron, in no scenario, is ever winning that 2007 NBA Finals. The fact that he got there against the Spurs is just impressive, right? I hate that argument that LeBron has lost. What's his record? Oh, what's his record? I don't think that's a good argument. I think the fact that he got there so consistently is impressive in and of itself. But I do understand the longevity debate, and that is why, like, I don't know. Like, if we did this list a year from now, Carson, maybe I might have LeBron higher. This is unparalleled longevity and dominance for a guy that is going to be 40 soon. 19 straight seasons of averaging 25 or more points per game. He had 13 straight playoff runs averaging 25 or more points per game. And the years that he's not, he's at 24, right? He has been a top 5 player in basketball for over 20 seasons. He's arguably been the best player in basketball for 15. Like, Jordan just can't say that, man. Jordan dominated. Jordan was dominant, but this longevity is on a different level. And I want to settle another debate, too. LeBron is the number 1 all-time scorer in NBA history, more points than anybody else ever. I still think LeBron is an underrated scorer. When people mention the greatest scorers of all time, Jordan, Kevin Durant, Kobe, I think they go to this because of the difficult shot making and because of how cool it looks. And damn, it does. Jordan and Kobe flying through the air, throwing down rim rattlers, spinning off of guys, KD included too, with just tough jumpers that other guys can't do. I think we take for granted how just purely dominant and how easy LeBron makes it look. He's the greatest rim pressure of all time with that combination of strength, of size, of athleticism, of burst, of vertical. You combine that with him just being able to jam almost anything, but with elite touch. He's ambidextrous. I don't know if you know this, Carson. I found this out a couple of years ago. I mean, LeBron does basically everything else left-handed, but he shoots right-handed, right? LeBron's great ambidextrous. He can do anything with both of his hands. Because of this, because he is so great at pressuring the rim and he gets the bulk of his scoring there, it weaponizes his passing. He's already one of the greatest passers ever where he can see over these angles. He's a great ball handler. But it just opens up the floor even more because of how great he is at collapsing defenses. And I think if you're looking at LeBron's absolute peak, because it's changed over years, man. In Miami, he's not dominating as much on the ball with the ball in his hands. In these Lakers years, it's been interesting to see these past few seasons, if it's Rondo, if it's Austin Reeves during this playoff run, if it's Dennis Schroeder, right, point to who you want. In those early years with Miami, if it's Dwayne Wade, if it's Mario Chalmers, LeBron's not dominating on the ball, right? He's doing a lot of stuff on ball. From 2015 to 2018 with Cleveland, that to me is the LeBron that you look at, where he is dominating and dictating every possession offensively and defensively. He's calling out plays. He's letting you know what's going on. He's just one of the most cerebral players of all time. LeBron's great, and I love LeBron. And if LeBron dominates like this for a few more seasons, maybe next season, I don't know what else it would take. LeBron has a legit number 1 case. I prefer Michael Jordan's pure scoring skill set because I think he's the greatest scorer of all time, and I value that so much more. I think at his apex, Jordan was a great playmaker. They're both great defensively. We made this debate a long time ago, Carson, with friend of the show, Gabe Schwartz. I love him to death. Biggest bronze sexual I know. I love you, Gabe. We did this debate a long time ago, and the fundamental crux of my argument is the same fundamental crux of the argument that I have here, and that's that we've never seen Jordan play as poorly on the biggest stage as we did see LeBron in 2011. Jordan never crumbled. We saw LeBron struggle in that one series, and it still leaves a shitty taste in my mouth when I think that was a winnable series. He's 19-11-4 in that series inefficiently. He's locked up. He's not balling. We just never saw Jordan like that on the biggest stage, man. I get, and other people are going to say, oh, Jordan got eliminated in the playoffs here. Jordan didn't do this. On the biggest stage, Jordan was impeccable. Jordan was perfect. We saw LeBron crumble one time, and ultimately I'm going to hold that against him too. But like I said, dude, Carson, if LeBron is at 25, 10, and 8 next year, man, I don't know, dude. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The longevity is insane. The complete totality of LeBron's game is insane. I just want to say, too, I appreciate and I love and I respect both of these guys so much. And I would never, and I think we should take our time to appreciate the greatness that we have in front of our eyes. And we should appreciate whatever else we get out of LeBron, because we spend so much time comparing and tearing down and contrasting. Just love it, man. Just appreciate how much time we have left with LeBron, because I'm gonna miss the fuck out of him when he's gone. I've hated him for a long time. I've rooted against him. I've rooted for the Warriors, but I'm in my loving and appreciating stage, and I'm gonna appreciate whatever else we get out of LeBron.
Logan for world peace. Logan been reading some self-help books. He's come to a state of actualization and acceptance, and now he's making amends with those who he's wronged. Yeah, in some ways, the GOAT debate is almost like the part of this entire top 25 that I've been least excited for, because there are so many all-time great players who we don't talk about enough, and talking about all of them and watching them and making their cases has been so fun. I think we talk enough about LeBron and Michael Jordan in general, but
Oh, for sure.
we're going to do
sure.
it again here. I will say, I think you got the wrong numbers for the Frozen One series. That was 18, 7, and 7
Oh,
on
my fault.
54% true shooting. I mean, we all know what the nature of that performance was at the end of the day. I have LeBron at number 2 as well. However, I think the margin is so slim. And I say that there is not a right or wrong answer to me, because I think it really depends on what you value, right? I value peak over longevity. I believe Michael Jordan had the higher peak. I would say that I value ceiling raising over floor raising. I think LeBron is the greatest floor raiser ever. I think Michael Jordan is the greatest ceiling raiser ever. I'll get into the details behind all of those conclusions as we go along. But first, I just want to touch on the stuff that puts LeBron undeniably at number 2, because I know there are still people out there who say Larry Bird is better, or who was it that said that if you dropped LeBron in the 90s, he'd be another Sean Kemp. Like, some people are out of their minds. But he is an all-time scorer and playmaker in a tier that is really historically rare, right? The regular season averages of better than 27, 7, and 7 on plus 4.4% true shooting versus league average. Playoffs 28.5, 9, and 7 on almost plus 4% true shooting versus average. And you mentioned as a scorer, right? He is one of the most overwhelming athletic forces, paint pressures that we've ever seen, with that blend of elite quickness and vertical ability in his early years combined with good strength, and then as he got older, still good quickness and vertical athleticism combined with elite strength. All of that has made him, in different ways, this dominant paint force initiating from the perimeter. But as he's gotten older, he's blended that with legit pull-up jump shooting, and particularly in the LA years and the second Cleveland stint years, a skilled post game and a level of advanced shot making out of there that I think has taken his offensive game up another level. I think I'm with you. 2015 to 2018 in Cleveland is his offensive peak. I definitely don't think it's close to his defensive peak. I think by 2017 and 2018 defensively, he's taken a real step back, and the effort isn't as consistent there. The athleticism isn't at the same level. He's not able to just go at all times, but that was the most evolved LeBron offensively to me. And he does, for this kind of athlete at this size, have such elite command of the game. His playmaking out of pick and roll, right? A brilliant skip passer, so committed to finding shooters and creating opportunities for them. And given how constantly he's pressuring defenses, he's as good at creating those kickouts as anybody ever. We've seen him thrive as a transition playmaker always, with the kind of athlete that he is, and a grab-and-go threat, and out of the post in his older years, right? You think about in the Lakers playoff run, some of the stretches he was most effective was, well, I'm either unguardable out of the post, or you're going to double me and I'll dissect you. So he really has added more wrinkles to his game. I will say, I think there are some people who say LeBron is like a top 3 pure passer ever, or the greatest pure passer ever, because I think there are people who will kind of say anything about LeBron. I definitely disagree with that. I think if you're looking at him versus Magic, there's a different level of vision that Magic has, of variety and deceptiveness and creativeness in terms of delivery. He misses like nothing magic. Whereas LeBron is a really, really good playmaker in terms of vision. He's not quite at that level or at the level of a Steve Nash, I would say. But bottom line, I mean, I'd say he's one of the 5 most impactful playmakers ever because of how great he is as a passer and how much pressure he puts on defenses with his scoring at all times. And it is incredible the different styles that he has adopted and dominated with, right? The unrivaled athlete playing the ultimate sort of heliocentric style, dominating the ball with crazy usage in the first stint Cleveland years and dragging teams with subpar talent to way overachieve, to then a bit more of the off-ball, highly efficient scoring weapon in Miami with, a stronger build at that point, building out his jump shot as well. And that's when he was a peak two-way force to me. And then the ultimate bully ball with the improved offensive skill, jump shooting, peak playmaking genius that we saw in the later Cleveland years. Like, it's incredible. Only he and MJ can be in this tier when we're talking about basketball dominance. And his two-way value at his peak was elite. You're getting secondary rim protection, given the kind of athlete that he was. Good rebounding. Great versatility, given the rare combination of size and strength with quickness and agility. So he could handle multiple matchups. He could handle switches as well as anybody. Very good transition defender, of course, when he wanted to be and gave that sort of effort. The chase down block is like his most iconic play. So the two-way value is very high. And I do believe he is the greatest floor raiser ever. And I think that that is pretty undeniable. If you look at what he did in 2007, going to the finals, in 2009, 2010, turning out 60-plus win teams, in 2018, leading that team to over 50 wins and to be elite offensively and go to the finals. Like, with the level of talent that was on those rosters, it's incredible. I don't think that anybody else ever could do it, and it's because of the sheer force that he can exert on ball every possession with that blend of scoring and playmaking. His career on-off, plus 10.8. Trails just Steph and KG this century. That's how much his team improves by with him on the court versus off it. And he's led 8 top 5 offenses, although never a number 1 offense in his career, which is interesting. But here's where I think there's a distinction to be made. Some people will point at LeBron's teams falling off without him, right? And say concretely, oh, well, that's what makes him the greatest. And I think that there are 2 different things we can look at here. Floor raising, where LeBron is the greatest, right? Taking, a capable athletic big and some guys who are just spot up shooters and nothing else. He can make those guys look a lot better with how much attention he's going to demand and his playmaking capability alongside that. But then there's ceiling raising, which is often driven by your versatility, your ability to dominate without the ball, to scale and excel and get better alongside other great players and make those players even better, maximize their more advanced, sometimes on-ball skill sets. There, I think LeBron doesn't quite compare to, like, Steph Curry, right, with the constant off-ball dimension that he demands, or a Larry Bird, a Nikola Jokic in terms of his versatility and off-ball impact, or, of course, a Michael Jordan, who I think is definitely a better off-ball player, a more versatile scorer, and that matters in terms of ceiling raising. If you're trying to win a title, you're going to have really good players alongside you no matter what. Like, yeah, LeBron has dragged some teams that were not talented to impressive heights. He's never dragged a team that was not talented to the title, though. To reach that highest pinnacle of the sport, you're going to be playing with good players, and there are different traits that enhance really good players than those that can bring up very meh players. So to be constantly demanding attention off the ball, to be able to attack in multiple ways, I think allows those other great players to thrive a bit more. Like, you think about what we just saw with Luka Doncic and Jalen Brunson, right? Luka elevates Dwight Powell. He elevates Tim Hardaway Jr. more than anybody else because he's creating high-value lobs. He's creating kickouts. He doesn't elevate Jalen Brunson because Luka's never going to curl around screens. He's never going to be actively cutting off ball and doing things that are taking attention away from a guy like Jalen Brunson, who can be a really good primary ball handler as well. And I just think the versatility of your attack is proven to matter. We've seen it in playoff situations. We've seen it in elevating the greatest teams ever. So I think that's an edge that Michael Jordan does have. And then I think if you value longevity over peak, I don't know that there's an argument for anybody other than LeBron. I legitimately don't. The totality of what he's done. I mean, 19 times All NBA, all-time leader in points, 4th in assists, 10th in steals, the 10 finals trips, like consistently elevating teams as he has. The longevity is absolutely absurd. But because I think Jordan's peak is higher, I think his ceiling raising is a bit better. I think the inevitability of his dominance at his peak was greater. I lean him. And then I do think, you mentioned it, dude, like the 2011 finals is a black mark that Michael Jordan doesn't have. And it is far from defining LeBron's career, okay? Mm-hmm. But when we're comparing nearly flawless resumes here, a flaw like that on the biggest stage, when you had a talent advantage and you had the opportunity to go out there and grab a title and you were just flat out bad, that does still matter to me. So, Logan, why is Michael Jordan your number one player of all time?
Michael Jordan is my number one player of all time, primarily because he's the greatest and most unstoppable scorer in NBA history. 8 30-point-per-game scoring seasons, 12 25-point-per-game scoring seasons, 12 30-point-per-game playoff runs. He's a 10-time league leader in regular season scoring and playoff scoring. And I think it's important to note between LeBron and MJ, another difference that we haven't gotten into yet is the era difference. Because a lot of people point to it and they're like, oh, you drop LeBron in the 90s. I don't know about the Sean Kemp bar, man. That's one of the wildest NBA bars I've ever heard, dude. Time out. I just went down a rabbit hole, dude. There's apparently a bunch of people on the internet that believe Sean Kemp was the first version of LeBron. What? I don't know. You need help. There is an important distinction to make between the eras of basketball, right? Primarily how defense was played. And what I mean by that is because the three-point shot is so important in today's league, right? You cannot leave anybody open from behind the arc. You are applying constant pressure from the three-point line and in. That does two things. It opens up spacing for the floor and it makes it, a little more open, but it also makes it harder to get into the lane too because you're being guarded from there, right? Jordan being defended too, he's going to get more of a cushion because they're just not afraid he's not going to pull it, right? In the 91 finals, right, they're not guarding him out to the three-point line. I think that's important to note. But still, this is the grimiest era of basketball. Nobody is getting buckets. You're getting to 80 to 90 points a game, and Jordan's giving you 35 to 40. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I think also the mythos of Jordan, the myth that Jordan is in the 90s, these 6 rings, the pedestal that we tend to put Jordan on, it's because nobody else ate. And I think this is a pigeonholed argument a little bit, but it is. Nobody else ate in the 1990s. That's something that makes Jordan a mythological creature. Patrick Ewing doesn't get a ring. Reggie Miller doesn't get a ring. Charles Barkley doesn't get a ring, right? Clyde Drexler doesn't get a ring until Jordan is out of the league and he's with the Rockets, right? Gary Payton doesn't get a ring till later with the Lakers. Sean Kemp doesn't get one. All of these legendary teams in the 1990s, there's so many guys that, the great Cavs teams, Jordan walled off. He said, sorry, this is my time to eat. This is my era of basketball. I think that's another thing that makes Jordan such a uniquely dominant force and why we put him in such high regard because nobody else accomplished anything. Nobody else climbed the mountain when Jordan was at the top of basketball. So many clutch shots, so many big moments, was the best on the playoff stage. I think his peak is higher than LeBron's. And I think you're right, Carson. I don't think that there's a longevity argument. I think if you like longevity, I think LeBron's your guy. I think if you want total impact, I think LeBron's probably your guy. But I just think MJ at his peak was unstoppable. Nobody was going to stop MJ from going out and getting a bucket. And for people that, I know we talked about this a couple years ago with the Gabe debate too. We talked about this in the Greatest Playoff Runs episode too and why Jordan was at our top. 1991 averages 11 assists per game in the NBA Finals. Everybody wants to point to that playmaking difference. I think MJ could have been a dominant playmaker. In 1991 is where we see him weaponize it on the biggest stage in basketball, and that's important to note too. He's also at 6 assists per game too, man. We look at these gaudy assist numbers. Look, man, it's hard averaging 6 assists per game for any period. Jordan did it for his entire career. He's a good passer, but he's the greatest scorer of all time, and he's a damn good defender too, man. The peak is the difference for me. If you like longevity, you take LeBron. If you want peak, if you want the greatest scorer ever, I think you take MJ. And I just value that more than anything else in NBA history, man. Like I said, though, there isn't a wrong answer in this debate, man. And I've come to realize that people get angry when you pick one or the other. It's like left and right Twix, man. There's not a mistake. You can go either side.
Well put, buddy. Appealing to all the Twix fans out there. And hey, I'm one of them. I love a good Twix. So, yeah, this starts with MJ being the greatest, and not just the most productive, but the most versatile scorer of all time. That really matters to me. He is the greatest rim finishing guard we've ever seen. And especially through the first three-peat, you are looking at one of the most spectacular athletes that there has ever been. Insane first step, elite vertical, really unparalleled body control in terms of his adjustments and his navigation of the paint, and an ability to elevate and adjust as a finisher that is just like, yeah, second to none. Then you also just have his twitchiness, his slipperiness in terms of getting to the rim. That was an elite trait of his. And he's lethal on and off ball. A dynamic cutter and catch and shooter who could destroy closeouts, use that as a way to pressure the rim as well. And then I believe is the greatest mid-range shooter ever. Unfortunately, we don't have the exact tracking data on this for most of his seasons, but we do have 1997 when he shot 49% for mid-range on almost 15 attempts per game. Like, that alone is the greatest mid-range shooting season on record, which starts in 97. That blend of volume and efficiency and the variety of ways in which he could do it, again, curling around screens as a catch and shooter, out of the post, as a pull-up shooter, out of pick and roll, it's unparalleled. And that combination of pull-up shooting and athleticism made him a great pick-and-roll scorer. That shooting combined with his phenomenal post footwork and the use of jabs and fakes and up and unders, and of course his patented fadeaway, made him one of the great post-scoring guards that we have ever seen. And his hang time, it's something that I would say really compared to one's peers, only he and Elgin Baylor have this kind of advantage where they are like so ahead of everybody else in terms of hang time that they can adjust and create unique separation on these sort of tough shots on runners and jumpers and avoid contests basically because they're just in the air for that damn long. His scoring peak, I think, is without a doubt the greatest ever. All the Chicago years, 31.5 points per game on plus 4.4% true shooting versus league average. Identical efficiency compared to league average as LeBron, which is kind of cool. Playoffs, 33.4 points per game on plus 3.2% true shooting. And in the finals, 33.6 points per game on plus 2.5% true shooting. He accounts for 34.7% of his team scoring. And Logan, I do think it's important to make the distinction that MJ played at a massive transitional point in terms of the style of basketball, right? The mid to late 80s are up tempo. They are an era in which offense and production on that end of the floor is actually really thriving. Then the mid to late 90s are the beginning of the low point in offensive production in NBA history going through the mid 2000s. So overall, his final scoring, keeping in mind that his second three-peat is in that absolute low point for pace, peak for physicality, just like ugly low-scoring basketball, the percentage of his team's points that he scored is the equivalent of scoring like 38 points per game by today's pace over the entirety of his finals career. So I think his edge over LeBron as a scorer is significant, not just because of volume. He's matching the efficiency, and the versatility is just superior. But then he does blend that with high-level playmaking. You mentioned 91. That, to me, is the most perfect player ever, that version of Jordan. The elite efficiency scorer, the insane athlete, and pull-up jump shooter with the post-game developed, the great playmaker and defender. I don't think anybody has ever reached that level. But as a playmaker, he was a guy who was going to collapse the defense routinely, and he could generally make the right read out of that. He was a quite good pick-and-roll playmaker. So I think LeBron certainly has an advantage there. I don't think that it's offset by the scoring production and the overall gravity of MJ's scoring, though, because of the versatility, the off-ball value, all the ways in which he could attack. And I think that that is supported by how great of an offensive engine Michael Jordan was. His first 5 title teams, he leads them to 4 number 1 offenses and a number 2 offense. 4 number 1 offenses. Like, that's, again, when we're talking about scalability, LeBron could elevate anybody to be good. But MJ, once you gave him a good supporting cast, right? Just young Scottie Pippen and some of the spot up shooting with BJ Armstrong and John Paxson and Craig Hodges in those early years. Well, now they are ahead above the rest of the league. And then, I mean, the second three-peat teams weren't that gifted offensively, but MJ's gravity is still elevating them to be the best in the league. Of course, he had Scottie, he had the dominant offensive rebounding of Dennis Rodman, but the spacing, the level of offensive skill certainly doesn't compare. That's MJ, like, so far and away driving them to be the best in the league on that side of the ball and overall. And then I do think he's one of the great defensive guards ever, and the greatest defensive playmaking guard that we have ever seen, which is not the most important thing. I certainly don't think he's the greatest defensive guard ever, point blank, but incredible instincts and timing on steals, generating turnovers. He did gamble a lot. I mean, that's just his nature. That's what MJ loved to do.
Yeah.
But I think more often than not, it was a positive. But then a uniquely strong shot blocking guard. He averaged almost a block shot a game in Chicago, 0.9, more than LeBron's career average. Just an insane vertical athlete, great timing there. So he was actually offering secondary rim protection as a helper. Great rebounding guard with his athleticism, and a stellar one-on-one defender. Phenomenal length, 6'11" wingspan, really good feet, great athleticism. So like any 6'6" player, he could only be like an important cog in a great team defense, right? He couldn't do what a Tim Duncan or an Akeem Olajuwon or certainly a Bill Russell could do as that sort of dominant rim protector, but he was a damn good defender on some damn good team defenses while driving some of the great offenses ever. So the impact on winning is massive. Bulls won 69% of their games with him throughout his career versus just 50% without. Now, that is including the 94 and 95 seasons when he wasn't on the team at all. If you just look at 84 through 93, when MJ played, they won over 63% of their games. When he didn't, they were 22 and 49, 31% win rate. And we only have the on-off data from 1997 and 1998, but he had an on-off differential of plus 7.3, which is quite good. And again, that is not close to peak MJ, in my opinion. Still the best player in the world, but like in the 89 to 93 range, he is much better. And so I think it's what I've been saying. I prefer MJ as a ceiling raiser. I think that he was better equipped because of the variety of his attacks to take an okay team or a good team to being absolutely great. Hey, we're going to win the title every year. Whereas LeBron would have the edge in taking a very mess supporting cast to being damn good and even being in those conversations. But I do think what MJ accomplished in really 11 healthy seasons in Chicago is remarkable, right? He does show up for the 86 and the 95 playoffs, but he misses a majority of both those regular seasons. 10 scoring titles, 5 MVPs, 6 rings. His teams averaged a 56-plus win pace when he was on the floor, and it does matter to me that once he was at his peak and he had even a good supporting cast around him. I mean, once Scottie reaches that star level, he did not relent. He absolutely dominated the league for those 6 seasons in a way that nobody ever has. And people want to legislate the help point to death, right? Who played with more overall talent. Mm-hmm. Here's what's undeniable. Once Scottie was at that level, once the roster was at that level, MJ got it done every year, right? LeBron has had title caliber rosters that didn't get it done, and I don't hold all of those against him because sometimes there was an even better roster out there if you're looking at the peak Warriors. But MJ's ability to climb that mountain as so far and away the best player on the planet over and over again and deliver in the biggest spots without fail. I mean, that inevitability, that gap between first and second place, I just think it's the most significant that we've ever seen. That unrivaled dominance at his best. It's the most important thing to me. And I understand if it isn't for you, but because I believe MJ has the highest peak ever, that's the most important thing to me. And that's why I still consider him the greatest player ever. And honestly, it's not going to be a question of more quality LeBron seasons. It's, to me, I think to change my mind, going to have to be a really meaningful sort of playoff run from LeBron at a really high level still, because I think if longevity were, important enough to sway this conversation, it would have probably already been swayed, given that LeBron is still a top 10 player going into year 21.
100%. I'm so glad that you bring that point up too, because I think that's LeBron fans' biggest argument against MJ is that MJ never won anything without Scottie Pippen. And to that, I just say that's a bad argument because every great player needs help. Every great team needs help. You're just not going to get it done by yourself. Like, yeah, man, LeBron didn't win a ring until he played with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. Like, you know what I mean? It's not apples to apples, and every great player is going to have great players that they play with to get the job done. This is a team sport. At the end of the day, you need a great team around you. But Jordan did his best to elevate those great teams. And what did those teams do without him? Nothing, man. They didn't. I mean, when Jordan left, it was Scottie's team, and they didn't do anything. He comes back for the playoffs. He's not at 100%. They don't do anything. I think Jordan's peak is higher, and I think you're right. If we were going to give LeBron the edge because of longevity, it would be done already. There is still time, though, like you said. Next season, I don't know. LeBron goes on another finals run. I don't know, man. I mean, if he dominates again, there's still time. So I'm still open to LeBron doing more to changing my mind on this debate. But for the time being, Jordan has solidified himself as my number one.
Well, I do just want to reiterate one last point because I don't want to dismiss that those Bulls teams were really good. And like famously, 1994, right, they do go out and they win 55 games. But that to me is the ultimate floor raiser versus ceiling raiser point, right? It's like if you took Trae Young off the Hawks, they would be so terrible, especially before they got DeJounte, right? Because that offense is so overwhelmingly reliant on him to create everything, okay? And maybe he has more of a singular impact in that context than like a Kawhi Leonard would in LA, where it's okay, you take him off that team, they can still be okay. Who has the skill set that scales better to a playoff setting? Obviously, it is Kawhi's variety of shot making, his brilliance as a scorer, superior two-way impact. In no way am I comparing Trae Young versus Kawhi to LeBron and MJ. I cannot emphasize that enough. My point is just that some teams are more fundamentally dependent on one player. That doesn't necessarily mean that that player is optimized for driving championship basketball compared to another guy. That's all I'm saying. The margin is so slim, but it's sort of the fundamental difference maker for me. And I do think it's worth noting that the Bulls added Kukoc for that 94 season and went from having been clearly the best offense in the league for the 3 previous seasons to 14th in offensive rating that year. So they maintained their defensive level, but they took a big hit offensively. I don't know. There's so many other arguments to address, right? People will talk about the competition thing. My 2 real points on that. Number 1, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to people playing down MJ's competition, right? He is playing great teams with some of the great players of all time who have been on this list, top 25 players for us, like Charles Barkley, like Karl Malone, of course, paired with John Stockton, the Blazers who had already been to another finals, right? The 64-win Sonics. Just great teams, but of course, I mean, we elevate teams and players based on getting rings, and if a guy keeps the opposition from getting rings, people won't view that team as favorably. I also think people say, well, like, how is LeBron supposed to beat the Spurs in 2007 or the Warriors in 2018? And I say, well, I don't hold those losses against LeBron at all. I think it's super impressive that he got there. At the same time, my take is like the East just sucked, okay? So I also don't want to totally overvalue that because my take would be what average finals team throughout NBA history are the 2007 Cavs or the 2018 Cavs, both of whom, by the way, got convincingly swept beating? Nobody, right? So I think sometimes people will overstate the like power imbalance in terms of competition there, but all of that to me is almost too theoretical. I think that we can look at these guys without trying to say, oh, what if we swapped out this player for that player, and just judge whose skill set, whose impact you prefer at their peak. For me, it's Michael Jordan, or if you prefer the longevity and you want LeBron James, good with me either way. So there you have it, folks. Our top 25 has concluded. Really hope you guys have enjoyed this series. I mean, this has been a lot of fun, but it's also definitely been a pretty heavy week over here at Nerd Sesh. So if you enjoyed the content, please subscribe to the Volume YouTube page. You can see more content from us here, all of our shows. You can subscribe to the podcast across audio platforms. You can follow us on social media, TikTok and Instagram at NerdSesh, Twitter at Nerd_Sesh. You can join our Discord. That is the link tree across our social media bios. And you can buy merch. We got the flags behind us. Logan's wearing a NerdSesh shirt right now. We've got hats. We've got hoodies. So you can find all of that at thevolume.com or also in our link tree. And with that, as always, I have been Carson Breber.
I have been Logan Camden.
And this was Nerd Sesh.